Thanks, Patricia, and thanks, Malaprops, and thank you, Heather. It's so nice to be in conversation with you tonight. I'm so excited to talk to you about this book. I just absolutely loved reading these stories, and I have so many questions for you. But before I bombard you, I would love if you could kind of start us out this evening by giving us a kind of a brief summary of this book, of these stories.
Sure. So it's 12 linked stories, and they're set on the campus of a private boarding school in the North Georgia mountains in 1969-70. Some of the characters are faculty families, a cafeteria lady, an elderly lesbian couple that works as the librarian and the choral director at the school, a World War II tail gunner who lives down the road at a home for alcoholic men. The stories they're standalone, but there is a plot thread that goes through them and helps sort of emulate the arc of a novel. And in writing the stories, I guess I just tried to find opportunities to let the characters visit other stories that they otherwise wouldn't have belonged in. So that was really fun.
Ooh, I love this idea of characters visiting other stories and kind of making an appearance. And that just immediately makes me wonder, like, when you were in the so one of the things that's so striking about this book is exactly as you say, there are all of these standalone stories, but the world is very much, not only interconnected, but we see characters at different ages, different points in their life, and kind of intersecting in different kinds of relationship with each other. And so I'm wondering then, in the process of kind of putting these together, can you tell us an example of when you were surprised by the way maybe a character visited a story, or by how some of these, storylines came together?
Yeah, some of the characters just started out as minor characters. For example, the elderly couple that I mentioned, the librarian and the choral director, they first appeared in a story that was from the point of view of two of the children in the novel, and all they were doing, the old ladies were doing, was giving treats to the kids when they trick-or-treated in July. Mm-hmm. But as I went along and started thinking more about a collection, those characters really kept kind of tugging at me. So I gave them their own story that goes all the way back to the 1920s, when they were young women in New Orleans. And it was just really satisfying to see a minor flat character get their day, So yeah, and that happened more than once as I was writing.
That's really cool. Yeah. And I know we're like not supposed to have favorites, and it's way too young to declare one. That couple is definitely, I could not get enough of reading about them throughout the course of this book. And I think part of the reason is that we get to kind of see their origin story, this like young relationship that they have, but then we also have this incredibly moving story about them in older life together, and this relationship that they develop. And I'm wondering about, like, as you were kind of conceiving of all of the characters in these worlds and how all of their lives connect together, how much did you kind of think about them as a sort of like unit, as this, whole sort of not town, but like I guess collective kind of unit? I'm thinking of like almost the Greek chorus nature of what a collected, short story collection kind of can do. And then, so how much were you thinking about this as an ensemble story from the beginning, I guess?
Not from the beginning. I was about 3 stories in before I realized that I was heading towards a collection. But then as I went on, it's a very isolated community. It's very insular. There's not a lot of people coming in or going out. And so in that way, it is a very tight, unified collection of people who are walking on the surface of this mountain, as one of the stories describes it, from the mountain's point of view. So it became more intentional as I went farther along. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I'm glad you brought up the mountains point of view too, because I think something that was really striking to me was the way that you bookend this collection. And we have these two really short, really lyric moments, pieces that that like change the length of time and change the kind of language. And so we like enter geologic time in the beginning of the book and the end of the book, and we have this like really lovely idea that a place might love you back. And so I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that choice and kind of, you know, the book ending and the way that came about.
Well, that those two bookends used to be one story, and they were the last piece that I wrote for the collection. It was sort of wrapping up everything. And then I made the choice to use the bookends as sort of a framework for the collection. So I lopped off the front piece and put it in the front and left the rest in the back. And then I also gave the mountain kind of a cameo appearance in one of the middle stories, Things Summoned, where the mountain sort of sends an alarm to one of the characters' mothers so that she knows that her daughter is in danger. Mm-hmm. The way that I love the mountains where we live, it's the first place I've ever lived that I really felt connected to place. And I've written about this before, just the way that my heart lifts up when I am driving back towards Asheville from Raleigh, where I visit family often, and I see those mountains around the bend for the first time, and it just makes my heart lift. So yeah, the speculation that I had was, well, what if that mountain is as happy to see me as I am to see it? So that's where that went.
It's such a lovely idea to have a mountain like its little rocky heart swell when it sees you
right
on the bend.
And the research on the geology of that piece was really interesting too. I learned so much. I learned that there are pieces of the Appalachian Mountains down in Mexico, and you know, there are sea fossils here in the mountains, and all kinds of interesting, fun stuff that I was able to put in there. So really fascinating.
How do you go about doing research? So do you know, kind of collect a bunch of interesting pieces of research first? How much do you sort of write a draft of a story and then fill in what needs to be filled in, or what's your relationship with research?
I try to do as little as possible because it's more fun just to make stuff up. But sometimes you can't do that. For example, in one of the characters in these stories is a World War II tail gunner, and I obviously knew nothing about flying planes in World War II. So I had to do some research there and read memoirs and accounts of pilots and airmen. The New Orleans story, the research actually inspired part of that story. I have a childhood friend who's an archaeologist who did a year-long dig on the grounds of Angola prison, which used to be 4 plantations. And she gave me a copy of her report. And the most fascinating thing about the report was that the warden and the other staff used prisoners as their servants, their house servants. And there was one instance where the doctor's wife was rude to her manservant and he slit her throat. But there were all kinds of fascinating things in that report that my friend had done. She had researched, you know, the history as well as the artifacts and everything. And I got a lot of inspiration from that, just for the backstory in that one.
Oh, that is so fascinating. And it kind of like speaks to, for me, what is one of my very favorite things about being a writer. And it sounds like this is very present in your life too. And that is like, just going about your day, you encounter these amazing things from the real world that then, you know, open your imagination, and, you know, not even necessarily, for me, it can become nonfiction or fiction, and, you know, and manifested in these beautiful fictional stories. But how amazing to get to kind of take those little snippets from the world that seems so unforgettable and getting to manipulate them into something else.
Yeah, to me, that's the fun part of writing. And sometimes after I've done that, I forget the origins. Like I forget for a while that was the little seed that started that story. And it's always kind of fun to go back and remember that it was just one little tiny thing that I saw or heard, that then I got to distort and twist into whatever I needed to serve the story.
Yeah. Well, so this connects to something that I've read you having written about or talked about elsewhere, which is the mink stole, right?
Yes.
This is something that is both part of a story and has an origin story in your own life, right?
It does. It does. Yeah, maybe I should read what I wrote in the story first, and then I can give you all the inside scoop on where it all came from. Let me see. So this is just the opening page from this story, The Stole. The mink stole, with its red satin lining, lay in its box on the bed like a piece of expensive roadkill. The mothball fumes that rose from it were strong enough to burn Lorna's eyes. She reached out a finger to touch it, feeling lumpy seams under the fur. The lining had faded in places, the fancy name worn off the fraying label, but the fur itself was exquisite, so soft it almost wasn't there. Her parents gazed down at it. I will not under any circumstances wear that thing, Lorna's mom said. Lorna's dad blinked behind his glasses, the worry line between his eyes deeper than usual. It's complicated. Her mom shook her head. Dark brown hair fell over her shoulders. That horrible old woman. She's only giving it to me because she knows her sister wants it. It smells, and those poor little animals. She especially wanted you to wear it to the fall gala, Lorna's dad said. She was Mrs. Dolores Vaughn Park, an old lady who gave a lot of money to the McMullen School. Mrs. Dolores Vaughn Park and her sister, Mrs. Sheila Vaughn Emery, were co-presidents of the Atlanta Women's Club. Mrs. Park was so bent over she was hardly taller than Lorna. A fascinating array of large moles showed through the white hair on her scalp. Mrs. Park and Mrs. Emery couldn't stand each other and used the McMullen School as their tug-of-war rope. Lorna's dad lifted the stole out of its box and draped it over his wife's shoulders. At least try it on. It's molded itself to Mrs. Park's shape, her mom said. Look how rounded it is. It's trying to bend me over. Sure enough, when she stood up straight, the stole puckered at both shoulders. If you don't wear it to the gala, you'll make her angry, Lorna's dad said. If I do wear it, I'll make her sister angry. Which one are you more afraid of? Lorna's dad sighed. Maybe it'll be unseasonably warm that night, and you can use that as your excuse to leave it home. Lorna's mom took the stole off and dropped it back in the box. I wouldn't be seen in that thing if it got cold enough to freeze hell. Lorna sat down on her parents' bed and examined the stole's box, peering through the clear plastic window in the lid. I could wear it, she said. Go get ready for school, Lorna, her parents said. So the true part of that is that there were these two elderly women at the church I grew up in Raleigh. And one of them gifted my mother her mink stole because she did not want her sister to have it.
Oh my God.
So, and my mother was like the last person in the world who would ever go out in public in a mink stole. So that stole has sat on my mother's shelf for 40 years and it's kind of a family joke. And I wrote the description of it in the story and I was kind of relying on my memory. And I really did remember it as having molded itself to this elderly woman's, hunched over form. So when I got it last time I visited my mother, I borrowed it. I would love to show it to you all right now.
Yes.
So here we go.
Oh my God.
It is not bent to anyone's form. It's lovely. It lies flat and it's very soft. I don't know what kind of condition it's in after being in a box for 40 years, but this is the stole that inspired the story. So there we go.
I love that bit of show and tell here.
Yeah, exactly.
Um,
Um,
sorry, go ahead.
no, that's fine. It was fun to give that. Sometimes when I'm stuck in my writing, an object is a way in for me.
Mm.
If I can find some sort of interesting object that I want to put into the fiction, then I can sort of, it's like a pearl in an oyster. I can build the story around that.
Oh, I love that as a way of kind of getting unstuck sometimes, or knowing that you have to build towards something specific that has a tangible life like that in the story. That's really
Mhm.
cool. I love the I mean, I really love that story in particular. And I think I will always remember now this image of this stooped woman with seeing the moles through her hair, and just like the perfect specificity of just imagining exactly who this person is. And I mean, one thing that we don't quite get into in the section that you read, but that it becomes this really important plot point kind of throughout a lot of these stories, is we have this tension between sort of social tensions that are going on between, we have these kind of elderly rich donors who have very specific ideas about what the school should be or is, and then we have these faculty members and Lorna's dad, who is the headmaster, who's kind of trying to be the negotiator, and Lorna's mom, who is sort of trying to figure out her place in all of this kind of throughout all of the stories. And I really loved her, the way she's kind of grasping and trying and succeeding and failing and all the way, throughout. But like, so there's this event that happens, and it's an important thing that happens throughout the set of these stories. And so we have this firebombing of a movie theater, after the theater does not let in some Black attendees who want to go see the movies. And then the firebombing is blamed on a group of people who I think we can presume are not the people who actually did it, although I'm not sure.
Yes.
But yeah, and so I think that one of the things that a lot of your stories do really well is kind of have there be these multiple tensions happening simultaneously. So, the kind of social stress or tension, for example, of like, these rich ladies in the stole and who's going to wear it and what kind of trouble you'll be in if you don't. And then this like much deeper undercurrent of like, how are people in the United States, or even in particular just in this part of Georgia, going to figure out sort of race relations at this moment in time. And so it's a delicate act, kind of bringing in lots of layers of these of social questions and tensions. And I guess that was just like a lot of word vomit to say, how do you how do you do that? How do you think about it? How do you layer all of those pieces together?
Well, if you think about that time period, 1969, 70, even though this community wants to be completely isolated and idealized and is mostly white, in that time period, even communities like that couldn't escape racial tensions seeping in, things about the Vietnam War. And that's the part that fascinated me, because I remember it from my own childhood. I was a pretty oblivious kid. We didn't have a TV, so current events went right over my head, and but things were going on, and the adults weren't explaining them. And I just remember trying to work through in my own child's mind, why did that happen? Why couldn't we do it that way? And it's just interesting to me to go back and explore some of those things with my grown-up eyes, and just try to figure out sort of the how a child's eyes open finally to things like racial injustice, and even how an adult's eyes can be opened. So that's kind of where I started poking and prodding to try to work on those
Yeah.
layers.
And do you think that, I mean, Do you think that writing or fiction or the short story in particular kind of allows you to do that in a way differently than, say, going to therapy or or something else?
Yes. Yeah, and it's a lot more satisfying. I think you're a lot more in control of how you let the story kind of seep out. Yeah, to me, that's the joyful part of writing, is being able to go through and figure some things out, and maybe make some people think without hitting them over the head with something. So
Yeah, and I mean, we do move, like, some of these undercurrents move in and out of the story. Like, you mentioned also the Vietnam War, and so there are references to the ways in which people in this community are impacted by the war. And it's very visceral and very real, and yet it's always kind of part of this larger living that everyone is doing. Everyone is has kind of these, I don't know, multifaceted dramas or desires or failed dreams or whatever. And so it, in a way, I think it just creates the stories feel really rich and textured because of that. I think because there are just lots of things happening, and so in each story we like largely focus on one character at a time. Some of them it shifts a little bit, but we mostly focus on one at a time. And I'm wondering, like, as you were kind of thinking about these different textures and these different characters, did you feel, so like writerly question, I guess here, did you feel like the distance that you had between these characters, this kind of close third person point of view, was sort of like, how did you settle on that as kind of the right distance for exploring a lot of these things?
it felt really natural to write all of these stories in a close third person, although some of the mountain stories have a bit of a more omniscient feel just because of the mountain as an entity. But, using close third person was another sort of way to unify the stories, in addition to having them all be set in the same place and have common characters. So for once, I didn't struggle with point of view in this book. In some of my other works, I've struggled mightily, but this one came fairly easily.
I'm glad to hear that. It's always nice when one of the
major elements of your work is not giving you a hard time. Exactly.
Yeah, totally. What do you think about, like, I guess about, like, when you kind of were figuring out how these pieces all connected together, and when you were figuring out what some of these through lines are, what did you start thinking about, like, that you were hoping a reader would take away from this book?
Well, you mentioned the common plot thread, which is this firebombing. And I chose that because when I was growing up in Raleigh, the case of the Wilmington 10 was prevalent from the time I was very young in elementary school all the way up until I was in law school. Just, the arrests, the convictions, the appeals, the pardons, of people who truly did not commit the crime that they were accused of and were put through this based on their race. So that was what I chose to sort of, structure that story. I've probably forgotten your original question, but does that answer it, like, inadvertently?
Yes, you nailed it. Yeah, I've forgotten it too, so we're in a good
we're even. That's right.
You've distracted me with interesting other things to think about.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so talking a lot about, like, kind of the internal explorations of some of these stories, I'm wondering about your life as a writer who also does many other things. Heather is a human who has many balls in the air. And I'm wondering about, so you have this like really amazing community presence in the way that you've been a founding member of the Flatiron Writers Room, and both part of the writing group and also part of this entity that just offers tons of great classes to the community. And I'm wondering how that part in particular has been influential in your life as a writer.
It definitely feeds my creative life. I'm an introverted person, but nothing makes me happier than to be around other writers and to be encouraging other writers. The students that I teach, or, my peers. To me, that's the most fun part about this writing life. Promoting books is not the fun part. And writing them is torture. So really the fun part is the people that you meet, and whether it's booksellers or other writers or young people who are trying it for the first time or whatever it might be. I just eat that up, and it feeds me in a way that you wouldn't think it would for an introvert. My partner Maggie Marshall and I at the Flatiron Writers Room, this is kind of our baby, and it makes us happy. It's a labor of love. So hope that we get to keep doing it for as long as possible.
Yeah, well, I do too, and so do many other people in the community I know who are very connected in with what y'all are doing. I like that you say that the experience of writing is kind of torturous. There's a great Robert Hass quote that I'm going to butcher it exactly, but it's kind of like, knowing you have to write later is torture. The writing itself is torture. The only perfect time of day is the experience of just having written.
Yes, exactly. To me, it's like when you clean up a really messy room of your house, it's torture to do it. But then when you're done, I always like keep coming back and looking in the door to look at how nice it looks. So that's kind of what writing is like for me.
Peeking back in to see how nice it looks. Yeah,
that's right.
That's great. Do you have a favorite character in here?
Well, I don't have a favorite. I mean, that's like asking who's your favorite child, asking a parent that. But I will say the second story I wrote in the collection was the one that's called McMullen Circle, that features these two kids, Lorna and Chase. And the inspiration for that story was me imagining what it would have been like to know my husband when we were both kids. Like, what if we had known each other then? And so Lorna is a lot like I was as a kid. She's a person who lives mainly inside her head and her imagination. So I'm not allowed to say she's my favorite, but perhaps she's the most like the young me.
She's also a kid who builds kind of secret forts out in the woods and squirrels things away there. Is that
right?
Heather move too?
It is. When I was a kid, I loved to run away from home. Not because I had an unhappy home, but because I just like to pack stuff up and then like wheel my baby carriage with like lunch meat and whatever else I could find off to in the stories, there's a place that this girl Lorna goes that she calls the Rocky Mountains. And I grew up in an apartment complex in Raleigh, and there was a big rock on the edge of the apartment complex. It was just a rock. I don't know how it got there. They built around it, but we called that the Rocky Mountains, and that's where I would run away to. So that definitely is from my own. Yeah, it's definitely autobiographical, the running away part.
I love it. Yeah, I really loved her as a character. She's a deeply thinking, deeply internalized character, and she also asks a lot of questions, some of them explicitly to her parents or to her friends, and some of them internally. But she, in some ways, I think, is a little bit of like a guide through some of these stories. I mean, she appears in a lot of them, and she kind of helps us think through some of the larger questions. And
she notices things. And I think children do that in a way, grown-ups stop seeing things. They stop seeing things like injustice, because things are the way they've always been.
Mhm.
But a child kind of comes at it with new eyes and can just ask the questions and make everyone uncomfortable. And there's a real role to play, in her doing that.
Yeah, we see that in particular. I mean, I'm thinking of this scene where she has this birthday party and she wants to go to the pancake house, and she has one of her friends is a young Black woman who's the daughter of a cafeteria worker, and it has her come along, and they go to this pancake house, and it's this deeply moving and uncomfortable scene where there's this direct kind of question of like, this is 1970, why is this a problem that this family is in here with this daughter and her friends, and
Mhm.
that and also not just looking outward, but the sort of pain that we get to see this character Edwina feel, and how that kind of reverberates out, and how Lorna is able to observe and take in that how this is impacting her friends. It's a really moving and lovely scene, and difficult.
Mhm. Well, thank you for saying that. The real part of that, if I'll give you all the seeds to the story, is my older sister invited a friend for her birthday to go with our family to the pancake house. And I loved this girl. She was absolutely wonderful, so much nicer to me than my real sisters were. And we went to the pancake house, and usually this girl was just, outgoing and gregarious and very comfortable in her own skin. And when we were in the restaurant, even though nothing overtly racist happened in that restaurant, she seemed to shrink. And I looked up to her so much and I admired her so much. And to see her kind of fold into herself out of the sheer discomfort, which I now realize was just, to be in that place at that time with a white family, it must have been a very awkward situation for her and uncomfortable situation. Um, so that was the shrinking part is what I took and then put it in that story,
Mhm.
in a more to show more overt racism.
Yeah.
Um, but it's funny how if you watch someone that you love so much, be taken out of their element and placed in a situation like that, um, it truly is painful. And that's what I wanted to kind of capture in that story.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think it's done really lovingly and painfully in all the right ways. And this is like one of the terrible parts of writing fiction, I think, is that we have to like put our characters into uncomfortable, terrible situations. You have to create these people that you love, and then, or even if you don't love them entirely, but that you're interested in and rooting for in some ways, and then cause them pain.
It's
Um,
true. My mother's a writer, and she often says, "Only trouble is interesting." If there was no pain, it wouldn't be very exciting to read.
yeah. How do you choose when to move a character toward pain and when to maybe pump the brakes? Because I mean, ultimately, I guess like mostly people seem okay. I mean, everyone in, all the characters in these stories have, all of them have obstacles, all of them have really difficult things that are happening to some,
Mhm.
but the degrees really vary. And so how do you, kind of try to balance when to put them into the fire and when to give them some release?
I guess I always like to bring my characters out on the other side rather than end on a devastating note. Um, and for me, sort of a more subtle range of experience for them feels more realistic than if, something absolutely devastating happened to them. I think people can learn the same lessons and change in important ways, even when what they're going through is more chronic than it is an acute or crisis event. So for me, it's interesting to kind of explore the subtle ways that people navigate life and are able to change and grow.
Yeah, we certainly see that in a lot of these stories. I think I like the way that you phrase that, like this idea of their kind of chronic troubles and
Mhm.
chronic challenges, and um, which feels really like the task of sort of getting through the day and getting through your life, and figuring out how
Right.
you keep going, and then when to really take a U-turn and make a different life choice, which we see a couple characters do. I'm wondering if you want to read us another little snippet. We're getting close to
Sure.
audience question time, so we'd love to hear a little more.
I can find my book under the mink.
Mink has eaten the book. Active revenge.
Sure. So this is the story about Danny the tail gunner. It's called Tupelo Rose, and I'll just read the opening couple of paragraphs from that. I really do love the Danny character. If I had to have another favorite, I would probably mention Danny, but I'll just read the very first part. Danny remembered the river, the way it curved like a thick snake under them, moonlight glinting off its scales, thick foliage rising up from both banks. The non-sound of the plane's missing engine taken out by flak, its voice no longer screaming with the other three. A chunk the size of a tire bitten off the tail. From the tail gun, Danny could see the hole. The hard yaw as Burton, the pilot, fought to hold her steady. Intercom silent as they all listened, parachutes ready. Sweat on Sweeney's face a few feet away despite the freezing cold. It was the river he always remembered first, before the bad stuff that followed. The way it gained texture and color as the plane lost altitude. He saw the S of that river in everything. The swirling paisley on Matron's skirt when she brought him his iced tea on the porch. The rubber bands the other Victory Home residents used for the slingshots they whittled. The red streak of enemy flare when the Germans spotted them as Danny hacked at Sweeney's parachute, trying to cut him loose from the tree. Sweeney's intestines swinging from a German soldier's bayonet while Sweeney screamed. The swayed back of the emaciated man Danny saw reflected in metal the day the Allies liberated the prison camp, before he realized the reflection was his. Nearly 30 years of S-shapes since the war, not one day free. Some better now because he wasn't drinking anymore. Some worse because he wasn't drinking anymore.
God, it's so heartbreaking and beautiful. I really, really love that. A couple of things just strike me hearing. Well, first of all, I love hearing it aloud after having read it on the page, hearing it in your voice. And I'm definitely struck by what you were saying before about the amount of research that it took to kind of understand the world of the planes. And you move so seamlessly though too, and this is also true. I noticed this very much. I think of the story Twilight Song. I think that's the right title, but you move so seamlessly between kind of times, and the way that I think in this really lovely way that our memories and experiences sort of slip between time veils, especially for maybe people who have undergone some pretty traumatic situations, as is true of Danny. And so, yeah, I wonder if you have any thoughts about that, or how you kind of think about moving through time in these stories or in your writing in general.
I think short stories lend themselves to that in a way that becomes more clunky and cumbersome in a novel, because the flashbacks are shorter. You can do a paragraph and then hit the old white space and be in a different place in time. So to me, there's a lot of facility in moving through time in a short story. It's just so much easier to lasso everything and to move back and forth without it being too clunky or staying in one time too long. So yeah, I don't know if you found that in your shorter fiction or not, but for me, it's much more easier to time travel in a short story.
Yeah, yeah, I think so too. I mean, I feel like it allows for some breathability, like your reader is willing to know that they're not going to get the full, the
Right.
full backstory or something, and so you can kind of move forward. And actually this ties into I'm seeing some really good questions here from some folks that are listening in, and it ties into one of these questions that I also was really wondering about. This question comes from Kim. Hi Kim. Given the narrow time frame and location, did you consider working this into a novel versus a collection of linked stories? Kim's caveat is that they have yet to read the collection, but looking forward to. So yeah, I was wondering about this too. When you have linked stories, it kind of asks this question about then how do we think about this versus a novel, and yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
At one point when I was mainly through with the collections, my agent asked me that, why don't you just turn it into a novel? But to me, the joy of writing stories is they are discrete and you can finish them in a finite amount of time and get the instant gratification of actually finishing something rather than having it hang over your head for 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
So I never gave it serious consideration. Someone could have written this as a novel, but I thoroughly enjoy just writing it as short stories, a beginning, a middle, and an end that took a few weeks rather than a few years. And I think people can still get a sense of the overall story if they're thirsty or hungry for something as substantive as a novel. But yeah, no, I was not going to turn it into a novel.
Are there other linked story collections that you read or returned to as you were working on this to kind of think about how other writers shape this form?
I really think that Olive Kittredge is the gold standard for taking linked stories to that higher level. I think it's a masterpiece. So I did reread that as I was trying to finalize the collection.
Nice. Yeah.
Yeah.
Book. Yeah. Cool. Okay, we have a question here from Robin. Hi, Robin. I kept having images of the Asheville school as I read the stories. Did you have that place in mind at all when you wrote these stories?
No, I'll tell you, the very first story I wrote is The Walk, which is the one about Carl Walenda walking the tightrope. And my husband grew up on the campus of Tonola Falls School in Tonola Falls, Georgia. His dad was a history teacher and they lived in campus housing. And they lived there when Carl Walenda walked the gorge. So that's the school I sort of had in mind, just in terms of thinking about community. Even though down the road there's another school called the Rabun Gap School, which looks more like your typical upscale prep school. But yeah, it was the inspiration for the community was Tonola Falls School. Although, even though I started with that, a lot of the memories come from my own childhood in Raleigh, growing up just in an apartment complex that was sort of the same sort of insular community. So I sort of drew not only from my husband's stories, but from my own childhood memories about what that time frame was like.
Do you think that there's something easier or kind of freeing about, like, so in some ways, some of the location or some of the kind of world of the school then is based kind of in your husband's experiences, and so is there something liberating about not being totally in your own experiences?
Yes, it makes my spouse very uncomfortable, but it is very freeing for me. And also, yeah, I mean, also, I really didn't adhere very closely to either his memories or mine. Again, the fun thing about writing fiction is you get to deviate. And one way that I sort of clued the reader in to the fact that I was not going to be factually accurate about the locations and, the history of this place was that I changed the place names by a letter or two, so that I'd be free to, I could put the jail where I wanted it. I could make up events that happened and racial demographics and that kind of thing. So even though I'm sort of true to the character of North Georgia, I'm not pinned down, and that was very freeing.
Yeah, having the ability to kind of base it in something familiar without having to be allegiant to it. Yeah.
Right.
And just a note here on the kind spouses who marry writers, y'all know what you're in for.
You signed on for it.
Signed on. Legally binding contract.
That's right.
All right, a couple of questions here from Lauren. Hi, Lauren. Lauren asks, Heather, what was the hardest part of this to write? Did a part or a character or a theme stick out as tough to crack?
Gosh, that's a good question, Lauren. I have to say this was one of the easiest births of a book that I've ever experienced, mainly because the stories are short. And for me, with my novels, structure and keeping it from lagging in the middle has always been the big challenge. And since these were stories, I didn't have that challenge with these. So there wasn't anything very angsty or truly difficult. The only challenges I had were towards the end, trying to make sure that I was putting them in the order that needed to be, and inserting elements from that would kind of unify them more than the first version of the standalone story. Just kind of trying to curate the collection as opposed to the individual stories was the only sort of had to work a little harder on that, but it was still not hard.
Yeah, well, I mean, what you're saying strikes me in exact sort of contrast to or conversation with the amazing reality that you have not one but two books coming out this year, and your other book is a novel where you I guess perhaps did have to kind of figure out how all the pieces go together. And so
Yeah.
I mean, what was that experience like kind of in comparison to writing this story collection?
It was different. It was also a lot of fun, though. The novel is about a puppeteer, so it's got puppetry and fairy tales in it, which I was just having all kinds of fun with. And people were saying that doesn't really belong in there, it doesn't make sense to the story, take it out. But I was like, what is puppets? So it was a lot of fun to write, but I did have to go through many revisions with the novel, just to get it to a point where the reader was as familiar with the world as I was in my own head, and the structure and the characters' motivations were as clear to the reader as they were to me. So that part was a challenge. Luckily, I had lots of good readers, including you, to help me along the way. So I think finally we've gotten it into shape where the reader may have at least close to the same experience that I had as I was writing it.
Yeah, well, it is a terrific novel. I love it so much. I'm excited for other folks to read that out in the world. Having spent a lot of time working on both forms recently, maybe this is like asking you to pick your favorite character, your favorite child, but do you feel like you would identify first with being a short story writer or a novelist at this point? Like, what's your relationship between the different forms right now?
I think I consider myself a novelist. It's been quite a while since I wrote any short stories. The last stories in this collection were finished a few years ago. And really the long form gives me the room that I feel like I need. I guess I'm just verbose. But yeah, whenever I have an idea come to me, it's typically going to require a lot of pages. So yeah.
The beauty and misery of that.
Exactly.
Yeah. There's another question from Lauren in the chat here. So, okay, part one of the question was thinking about the hardest part of this to write. And then second question is on the flip side, when did you celebrate during your writing or publishing journey? Was there a moment or moments that made you want to whoop with glee?
Gosh. Lauren, I need to start whooping with glee more. I'm going to get you to start calling me up and reminding me of that. I, I'm such a nose to the grindstone type of person. I was certainly glad to finally find a home for it. I had finished the collection and curated it, I guess by like 2014, and actually had a couple of other small press offers on it that fell through for various reasons. So as I was writing novels, I was also trying to figure out, well, what do I do with this short story collection? Entering it in contests and querying small presses to no avail. So I was really happy when Regal House selected it as a finalist for its contest and offered to publish it. I think it's the perfect home for it. It's a Southern press. This is a collection of Southern stories. So I'm sure I did some whooping when that happened.
May we all be reminded to whoop as often as.
Yes, exactly. I need a cross stitch that says whoop. But
I wonder if you have any words on that. I mean, perhaps there's some folks who are kind of listening in right now who know, as this is a very familiar feeling to me. You've had this experience too, the kind of inevitable frustration that comes with trying to put your work out into the world, and really the word is escaping me right now, but sort of just the long-term toughness that it requires to not feel defeated by the experience. And I mean, any words from you of how you kind of get through that?
I've known so many writers who were so much more talented than me who quit because they just decided it wasn't worth it. All of the rejection and how long it took for everything to happen, if it ever happened at all. But I would just say, if you're writing something that you love, and if you are like, once you write it, you're going to the door to look at how neat the room is or whatever, have faith in what you've written, and make a plan for how you're going to try to get it out there to readers. You may not get your first choice, you may not get your second choice, but there's always ways to get things out there so that more than one person, more than just your mother, can read it. I was reminded of that this month. A elementary school teacher of mine sent me a little book that my best friend and I had stapled together and written about a horse, some adventure of a horse. And I started thinking about, I remember those days when I had so much confidence in my own writing and drawing that I would staple the pages first and then just be completely sure that whatever I wrote was going to be wonderful. And so I was kind of thinking, I just need to make some little books like that and not worry about getting them published. Just staple the pages together, fill the pages, accept that it's just going to be wonderful, and kind of get back in touch with that creative, but before the world, imposed all of its requirements or whatever. So I would recommend that as a good exercise. Just get your stapler out or go to Kinko's or something and Xerox your book and get it out in the world like that.
I love that. I love that. You're committing to getting it out there before you even have to worry about
exactly.
Yeah. We are almost out of time. I see one more question here from someone in the audience. So this question comes from Jeff. Hi, Jeff, or Jeffrey, excuse me. Heather, given your work schedule as an attorney, I'm curious what your writing practice looks like. How do you find time for your writing? The golden question.
Yeah, that is the age-old question. And for me, it's changed. It's interesting how you go through seasons. For years, I set aside Fridays to write and was pretty religious about that. I would go to my law office and write on Fridays. In most recent years, though, I seem to do better if I can carve out like a 5-day block. So I don't write every day, but I do try to slip away. We have a cabin in North Georgia, of all places. And I go down there and just write in a block for 4 or 5 days at a time, and then come back and steal as much time, throughout the week as I can. But it's really those sort of marathon sessions that get my work done these days.
I know you just had one of those recently. Any tiny secrets you can tell us about what's coming down the pipeline? What you're working on?
I'm playing around with a sequel to my first novel, Under the Mercy Trees. Kind of the main character is a young woman who's sort of the next generation of that family. There's a ghost story in Under the Mercy Trees that I wanted to revisit. So it'll have a lot of ghosts in it. So I'm about 15,000 words into that and still trying to feel my way and make sure that that's the project that I want to devote my time to. But so far, so good.
That is really exciting. That's really cool. Well, we're running out of time here. Any last things that you wanted to share, Heather? Anything kind of parting words?
I just want to thank everyone who is online tonight watching this. We just went through Snowgeddon, and you've got COVID to deal with, and Lord knows what else. And it really means a lot to me that you all showed up to listen in and think about the book. And I also just want to say so much thanks to you, Tessa, and to Malaprops for helping me bring this thing into the world. It's awesome.
Well, I can't recommend this book enough. I just devoured these stories and then remembered I needed to actually like pay attention and write notes and stuff. So I just have had a wonderful time with them and hope everybody gets the chance to read them and love them as much as I do. So thanks for chatting, and thanks Malaprops for having us. Best Bookstore. So good to be here.
Absolutely.
Well, we want to thank you both. Congratulations, Heather. And we're so glad that we had an opportunity to hear this wonderful, enlightening, and engaging conversation between two people who seem to admire each other and do close reads of each other's work. And that makes it all the richer. So we really appreciate that. We're glad we're here for you. And we're glad that our virtual audience got the chance to be here with us. Thank you all so much, everyone. And have a good evening. Be safe out there.
Thank you.